Hi friend, welcome to the live study channel. Today I am going to discuss exception handling, interview question and answer. So let's start. My first question is, what is an exception in Java? So exception is an error event that can happen during the exception of program and disrupt its normal flow. Exception can arise from different kind of situations such as wrong data entered by user, hardware failure, network communication failed. Whenever any error occurs while executing a Java statement, an exception object is created. Then JRE means Java Runtime Environment try to find exception handle to handle the passed to the handler code to process the exception known as catching the exception. If no handler is found, then application throw the exception to the runtime environment and JRE terminate the program. Java exception handling framework is used to handle runtime error only. Compile time error are not handled by exception handling framework. Okay, I will discuss in another video and another class also. So move to the another class. Another question is, what are the exception handling keyword in a Java? There are four type of exception handler. Okay, first throw, throws, try catch, and finally. So let's discuss throw. Throw is means sometime you explicitly want to create exception object and them through it is halt the normal processing of program through keyword is used to throw exception to the runtime to handle it. Another one is throws. The throws means when we are throwing any checked exception in a method and not handle it, then we need to use throws keyword in method signature to let caller program know at the exception that might be thrown by method. The caller method might handle this exception or propagate it is to its caller method using throws keyword. We can provide multiple exceptions in the throws cases clause and it can be used to main method also. Another point is try and catch. You can mention the main method, right? Main method. Try catch. We use try catch block for exception handling in our code. Try is the start of the block and catch is at the end of try block. To handle the exception, we can have multiple catch blocks with a try and catch block can be nested also. Catch block required a parameter that should be of type exception. Last point is finally. Finally block is optional and can be used only with try catch block. Means without try catch block we cannot use finally. Since exception halt the process of execution, we might have some resource open that will not get closed. So we can use finally block. Finally block get executed always whether exception occurs or not. Another question is, how does exception handling work in a Java? Okay. There are 4 steps to handle exception handling work in Java. First step is when an error occurs within a method, the method create an object and handle it up to the runtime system. This object is called an exception object. The exception object contains information about the error, including its type and the state of the program when the error occurred. Creating an exception object and handle it to the runtime system is called throwing an exception. Second point is, after a method throws an exception, the runtime system attempt to find something to handle it. The set of possible some time to handle the exception is the ordered list of methods that had been called to get to the method where the error occurs. The list of methods is known as the call stack. The following diagram shows the call stack of 3 method calls, where the first method call to the exception handler. Third step is the runtime system sorts the call stack for method that contains a block of code that handles the exception. This block of code is called an exception handler. The search began with the method in which the error occurred and proceed through the call stack in the reverse order in which the method were called. When an appropriate handler is found, the runtime system passes the exception to the handler. An exception handler is considered appropriate if the type of exception object thrown match the type that can be handled by the handler. The exception handler chosen is set to catch the exception if the runtime system exhaustively searches all the methods on the call stack without finding any appropriate exception handler, as shown in the following diagram. The runtime and considering through the program. Another question is, what is the difference between error and exception? Error are mainly caused by the environment which an application is running. For For example, out of memory error happen when JVM run out of memory, whereas exception are mainly occurs by the application itself. For example, null pointer exception occurs when an application try to access null point object. Another question is, can we write only try block without catch and finally block? Answer is no. It's so complication error. The try block must be followed by either catch or finally block. You can remove either catch block or finally block without block, but not both. But not both. Explain Java exception handling hierarchy. The first point, so the hierarchy means the point is a through all exception inherit in through class. Okay. Java, I will discuss some point means exception, error, exception. I have already discussed error and exceptions, and the error means just checked exceptions. IO means input output exception, class not found exception, class supported exception, runtime exception. So means error. So Java exception are hierarchy and inheritance is used to categorize different type of exception. Means through, just point by through is the parent class of Java exception hierarchy, and it has two child object means error. There are two child means error and exception. Exception are further divided into checked exception and runtime exception. Exceptions means divided those means errors. Exception are further divided into checked exception and runtime exception, but error are especially exceptional scenario that are without a scope of application. It is not possible to anticipate and recover from them. For example, hardware failure, JVM crash, out of memory exception. But checked exceptions are exceptional scenario that we can anticipate in a program and try to remove from it. For example, file not found exception. We should catch this exception and provide useful message to user and log it properly for debugging purpose. Exception is a parent class of all checked exception. Another point is runtime exception. Means runtime exception are occurs by bad programming, for example trying to retrieve an element from the array. We should check the length of array first before trying to retrieve the elements, otherwise it might be through array index out of bound exception at the runtime, and runtime exception is a parent class of all runtime exceptions. out of bound Okay, in legal and arithmetics array. Okay, another question is, what is difference between checked and unchecked exception in Java? Checked exceptions should be handled in the code using try catch block, or else the method should use the throws keyword to let the caller know about the checked exception that might be thrown from the method. Unchecked exceptions are not required to handle in a program or to maintain them. It throws close of method. The exception is a superclass of all checked exception. Otherwise, runtime exception is a superclass of all unchecked exception. Note that runtime exception is a child class of exception. Checked exception are error scenario that require being handled in the code, or else you will get a compile time error. For example, if you are using file reader to read a file, it throws the file not found exception, and we might catch it is try catch block or throw it is again to the caller method. Unchecked exceptions are mostly caused by poor programming. For example, the null pointer exception when invoking a method on an object reference without making sure that it should not null. I can write a method to remove all the vowels from the string. It is the caller responsibility to make sure not to pass a null string. It might change the method to handle this scenario, but ideally the caller should take care of them. Another question is, what is the difference between throws and throws keyword in a Java? The throws keyword is used with a method signature to declare exception that the method might throw, where the throws keyword is used to disturb the flow of program and handle over the exception object to runtime to handle it. Throw keyword is used to throw an exception explicit. It can throw only one exception at a time. For example, throw only an IO input expression means throw new IO exception. Throws keyword can be used to declare multiple exceptions separately by comma. Whichever exception occurs if met with the declare once it throw automatically. For example, void demo throw arithmetic exception, null point exception statement, this one. Another point is, how can we write a custom exception in a Java? In a bigger application, most of the cases we need to custom exception for representing business exception are at a level higher than technical exception defined by the JDK. Where are the steps that create a custom exception? Create a new class who name should end with the exception, like the class name exception. This is the convention to differentiate an exception class from regular ones. Make the class extend one of the exceptions that are sub type of the java.long.exception class. Generally, a custom exception class always extends directly from the exception class. Create a constructor with a Spring parameter with this detailed message of the exception. In this constructor, simply call the super constructor and pass the message. In Java, there are two types of exception: checked and unchecked exception. What is the difference between final and finally and finalize in a Java? The final in a custom application, just wait, just little bit discuss in a custom exception. Okay, just one example. Okay, it's not a very big deal, but just I will discuss. Okay, wait. Custom. Suppose just create a class. Okay, public class. Okay, resource not found exception, then extend an exception, right? Then private static final dot long. Okay, employee id. Okay, id is equal to 1. Then create another one is the public resource not found exception, and put the method in a object. Okay, employee id, and then you can create the super employee id not is equal to null, means create in a method object. I just pass the means a super employee id not is equal to null, means you cannot null. Then employee id dot to string equal to null, right? This is called the custom exception. Another question is, what is difference between final, finally, finalize in Java? Final is used to apply restricted on the class, method, variable, and the final class cannot be inherited, nor it cannot be overridden or change any. Finally means this keyword used to the try catch block to provide a statement that will always get executed even if the some exception arise. Usually finally is used to close resource. Finalize is used to perform clone up and processing the just before the object is garbage collection. Okay, another question is, what is exception chaining in a Java? Exception chaining is a popular exception handling concept in a Java where another exception is thrown in an exception of an exception and creating a chain of exception. This technique mostly used to wrap a checked exception into an checked exception. A runtime exception. By the way, if you are throwing a new exception due to another exception, then always include originally exception so that handler code can access root cases by using the method like get case and init case method. Another question is how you retain your own custom exception in how do you do that. The main purpose of asking this Java exception interview question to this find out of how you use this feature. This can be used for sophisticated and specific exception handling with trick involved in a weaker. You should choose a checked or unchecked exception by creating a specific exception for a specific case. You also give lot of option to caller to deal with them elegantly. I always prefer to have a prefix exception and then a general exception. Through creating lot of specific exception quickly increase number of classes in your project. Maintaining a particular balance between specific and general exception are key to success. Move to the another question. Another question is how have you faced out of memory error in a Java? How did you solve that? Everyone is Java development face java.long.out of memory error now and them. Out of memory error in a Java is one problem which is more due to system limitation memory rather than due to programming mistake. In most cases, through in a certain case you should have a memory leak with cases out of memory error, and I have found that through the java.long. Another question is what are runtime exception in a Java? Give a few examples. The exception that occurs at a runtime are called runtime exception. The compiler cannot recognize this exception. Like unchecked exception, it is include all subclass of java.long runtime exception and java.long error. For example, include number format exception, null pointer exception, class cost exception, array index out of bound exception, stack overflow exception. Another question is consider three statements in a try catch block. Statement 1, statement 2 and statement 3. It followed by a catch block to catch the exception that occurs during the exception of the try block. Assume that the exception is thrown at a statement 2. Do you think the statement 3 will be executed? Answer is no, statement 3 will be not executed. If an exception is thrown by the try block at any point, the remaining code after the exception will not execute. Indeed, the flow control will directly come to the catch block, means not a 3. Another question is it is often recommended to keep cleanup operation like closing the database resource inside the finally block. Why it is necessary? Means the finally block is always execute irrespective of the fact if exception are arised in the try block or if the arise exception are catch in the catch block or not. Keeping the cleanup operation in finally block ensure the operation of these operation in any case and will not be affected by exception which may or may not arise. Another question is why are using finally, finalize and finally and finalize in a Java? The first one is the finally is a keyword that can be used to make a variable, method or class as unchangeable. To put it simply, if a variable is declared as a final once it is initialized, its value cannot be altered, means you cannot update. If a method is declared as a final, it cannot be overridden or modified in a subclass. If a class is declared as a final, it cannot be extended in a further class. Second point is finally finally is a block which is used to exception handling along with the try catch block. This block is always executed irrespective of arise exception, or if the arise exception is handled. Usually this block is used to perform cleanup operation to close the resources like database connection, input output resource, etc. Third one is the finalize method. Finalize is a method, is a protected method. It belongs to a java.long object class. Every class created in a Java inherit this method. The garbage collector thread call the method before an object is removed from the memory. If an object is removed from the memory, this method is used to perform some of the cleanup operation. Another point is it is possible to override a superclass method that throws an unchecked exception with the checked exception in a subclass. It is not possible because if a superclass method throws an unchecked exception, it will be overridden in a subclass with the same exception and any other unchecked exception, but it cannot be overridden with checked exception. Means cannot overridden in a checked exception. Another question is why it is always recommended that cleanup activity like closing the DB connection input output resource to keep inside a finally block. Final block will always be executed exception. One scenario as discussed in above class in question number 10. By ensure the cleanup operation is finally block, you will assume that those operations will be always executed irrespective of whether an exception has been occurred or not. Another question is what will be the result of main method throwing an exception? If an exception is thrown by the main method, the Java runtime environment will terminate the application and print the stack trash in a system console along with the exception message. Now when you are done with the most popular Java exception handling introduction, we had here to be connect with the higher opportunity in the domain. Thank you for valuable response and please write and subscribe this channel.